The voice of Silas Blackwood, sharp as shattered glass, cut through the humid afternoon air, his words a lash against the silent, sun-baked faces gathered in Redemption's dusty town square, a place that today seemed to mock its very name. A witch! A purveyor of dark arts, a blight upon our God-fearing community. Sold to the highest bidder, for the good of this town, for the purification of our souls. On the crude wooden platform, hastily erected like a gallows, stood Ilara. She could be no more than 19 summers, her hands bound cruelly before her with coarse rope that bit into her tender skin, her spirit a flickering candle flame in a hurricane of collective fear and judgment. Yet, through the curtain of her disheveled hair, a spark of untamed defiance still glinted in her wide, frightened eyes the color of a twilight sky, now scanning the hostile crowd, finding only the chilling glint of morbid curiosity, the downturned gaze of shame, or the hard glint of superstitious hatred. Dust devils, miniature whirlwinds of grit and despair, danced at the periphery of the assembled townsfolk, mirroring the vortex of terror threatening to consume her. Blackwood, a man whose corpulent shadow seemed to stretch further and with more menace than his physical frame, paced before her like a bloated vulture, his fancy silk waistcoat a stark, obscene contrast to the raw despair he so skillfully peddled. He owned the First Redemption Bank, the Gilded Cage Saloon, the sprawling Circle B ranch that choked half the county, and now, it seemed, he sought to own a human soul, to crush it beneath the heel of his ambition. Who among you righteous citizens will start the bidding for this creature? He boomed, his voice a greasy caress, a vile mockery of auctioneering civility. Rid your homes, your families, of her insidious blight. What am I bid for the witch, Ilara? A few nervous coughs punctuated the heavy silence, the anxious shuffle of worn leather boots on parched, unforgiving earth, but no voice rose to meet his challenge. Fear, raw and potent, was a currency Blackwood hoarded and understood with chilling intimacy. It was the bedrock of his power in redemption. He smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his fleshy face, savoring their terror. Then, from the very edge of the hushed crowd, where the shadows of the general store offered scant relief from the oppressive sun, a hand was raised. A single, large, calloused hand, belonging to a man who stood as rooted and silent as the ancient, towering pines he felled for a meager living in the deep woods far beyond the town's judgmental gaze. Jedediah, the lumberjack. His face, weathered as old, storm-tested timber, a road-map of sun and sorrow, showed no discernible emotion, yet his eyes, the startling grey-blue of a winter storm about to break, were fixed, first on Ilara's pale, sweat-streaked face, then with an almost imperceptible shift, on the preening figure of Blackwood. The crowd, a moment before a monolith of shared apprehension, stirred, a collective ripple of disbelief and hushed murmurs spreading like wildfire through dry grass. Jedediah. He rarely ventured into redemption, preferring the stoic company of trees and the whisper of the wind. When he did, his words were as scarce as rain in a drought. For him to raise a hand, to interject himself into such a volatile, public spectacle, was an event akin to the earth itself shifting on its axis. Blackwood's sneer faltered, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing his usually confident features. What new devilment was this? What game was the silent woodsman playing at now? This was not part of his carefully orchestrated theatre of cruelty. Silas Blackwood's eyes, small and pig-like, narrowed into slits, suspicion warring with avarice. The lumberjack bids, he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension, attempting to regain control of his audience. And what, pray tell, does a man of the deep woods, a hermit more comfortable with squirrels than society, offer for such tainted merchandise? Jedediah's voice, when it finally came, was low, a deep rumble like distant thunder, a sound rarely heard, unused but deeply resonant, carrying easily across the suddenly attentive square. Everything I have, he stated, the word simple, yet laden with an undeniable weight. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The townsfolk knew he lived a Spartan, solitary life, his cabin little more than a hunter's shack nestled far in the wilderness. Yet, persistent rumors, whispered in hushed tones over watered-down whiskey in the Gilded Cage, spoke of a hidden cache from his younger, wilder prospecting days before he settled into the rhythm of the axe, or perhaps it was just a lifetime of frugal, almost monastic hoarding. Blackwood's sneer returned, fuller this time, twisted with a fresh surge of avarice and contempt. Everything, you say? A bold and empty claim, lumberjack. Let's see the color of this supposed everything before we waste more of these good people's time. Jedediah, unperturbed by the taunt, slowly, deliberately, unslung a heavy, worn leather satchel from his broad shoulder, a satchel he was never seen without, its contents a perennial mystery to the curious eyes of redemption. He unfastened the tarnished brass buckles with methodical care, the silence in the square growing so profound, so absolute, that one could hear the frantic, terrified thrum of Ilara's heart against her ribs, the dry rasp of Blackwood's own impatient breath. Jedediah reached inside the satchel and pulled out not a bag of coin, not a poke of gold dust, but a folded, yellowed piece of parchment. A deed. The deed to his timber claim, the one encompassing the lost Bear Creek Basin, a claim boasting the richest, densest vein of old-growth pine for 100 miles in any direction, a claim that Silas Blackwood himself had coveted and tried to acquire for years through various underhanded means, legal trickery, and veiled threats, all of which Jedediah had silently, stubbornly rebuffed. This, Jedediah stated, his gaze unwavering, his voice steady as he held the precious parchment aloft for all to see. For the girl a collective gasp, sharp and sudden, swept through the crowd. Men exchanged shocked glances, women pressed hands to their mouths. Blackwood's face, moments before flushed with smug triumph, began to purple with apoplectic rage. This was far more than money, this was a calculated, public humiliation, a brazen defiance of his carefully constructed authority, a direct challenge he could not ignore. Yet, the law, such as it existed in the rough-and-tumble town of Redemption, had to be observed, especially when a man made a public offer, witnessed by the entire populace. Sold. Blackwood spat, the word like venom forced from his lips, his eyes burning with impotent fury. Sold to the mad, interfering lumberjack. Take your cursed prize, and may she haunt your solitary days and bring ruin to your miserable existence. Jedediah moved forward then, his steps measured and unhurried, impervious to the venom in Blackwood's voice or the stunned stares of the crowd. He mounted the crude platform, his sheer physical presence, the quiet strength emanating from him, seeming to offer an invisible shield against the poisonous atmosphere. He didn't spare Blackwood so much as a glance. His entire focus was on Ilara. From his belt, he drew a small, razor-sharp skinning knife, an instrument he normally used for practical, mundane tasks. Now, with a touch that was surprisingly gentle for such large, calloused hands, he carefully, meticulously cut the cruel ropes binding Ilara's wrists. The skin beneath was raw and bruised, angry red welts testament to her ordeal. He then sheathed his knife and offered her his open hand. She hesitated for a long moment, fear still a palpable cloud in her gaze, her body trembling from exhaustion and terror. But then, looking up into his stoic, unreadable face, she saw something flicker deep within his storm-grey eyes, not pity, which would have felt like another form of violation, but a profound, unreadable gravity, a silent understanding that transcended words. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her small, trembling hand into his. His grip was firm, reassuring. He led her down from the platform of her humiliation, the crowd parting before them like the Red Sea before Moses, their hushed, incredulous whispers following like a swarm of unseen, biting flies. He guided her not towards his waiting supply wagon, which was pointed towards the distant mountains and his solitary cabin, but towards the modest, clapboard house at the quiet edge of town, the one with the neatly tended porch roses, the home of Mrs. Abigail Gable, the kindly, no-nonsense widow who ran the town's only respectable boarding house. He hadn't spoken another word to Ilara since his monumental bid, his silence as profound as the declaration it had contained. Jedediah halted his small procession before the weathered, welcoming porch of Mrs. Gable's establishment. A painted sign, faded by sun and time, read Gable House, Rooms and Victuals'm, he said, his voice still rough from disuse, yet softer now, tinged with a respect he rarely showed, addressing the silver-haired woman who appeared at the screen door, her intelligent eyes, framed by fine wrinkles, taking in the scene with a mixture of well-earned curiosity and inherent concern. This is Ilara. She needs a room. And a decent meal. And perhaps some kindness. I'll cover all expenses. He pressed a small handful of coins, surprisingly weighty, into Mrs. Gable's outstretched palm, far more than would be required for a few nights' lodging. Mrs. Gable, a woman who had weathered her own share of life's brutal storms and unexpected kindnesses, simply nodded, her gaze assessing Ilara with a profound, unpitying sympathy that spoke volumes. She had seen the ugly spectacle in the square from her window, her heart clenching with each of Blackwood's pronouncements. "Of course, Jedediah. Bring her in, child," she said, her voice warm and steady, a balm to frayed nerves. "You look like you've stared into the abyss," and it stared right back as Ilara, leaning slightly on Mrs. Gable's supportive arm, was gently guided inside. Jedediah lingered on the porch, his tall frame silhouetted against the harsh afternoon light. He was acutely aware of the townsfolk still watching from a safe distance, their faces a confusing amalgam of suspicion, grudging awe, and outright bewilderment. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary face showed the constant strain of trying to impose order on a fundamentally disorderly frontier, approached, his hand resting instinctively on the butt of his holstered Colt Peacemaker. "Jedediah," Brody began, his voice attempting an official, stern tone but unmistakably tinged with a deep-seated unease. "That was a damn fool, reckless thing to do. You know Silas Blackwood. He ain't gonna let this slight lie. He'll come for you. Or for her, or both." Jedediah merely looked at the sheriff, his expression unchanging, a granite cliff face against which accusations and warnings seemed to break. "He has no legal claim on her now, Sheriff." The sale was made, witnessed by all. The Brody sighed, a gusty exhalation of frustration, and rubbed his grizzled jaw. "Legal claim, maybe. But you and I both know men like Blackwood forge their own damn laws with money and menace. Why, Jedediah? Why this girl? What in God's name possessed you?" Jedediah's gaze drifted past the sheriff, towards the lace-curtained window through which Ilara had just disappeared. A flicker of an old, deep, almost unbearable pain crossed his face, so fleeting, so quickly suppressed, that Brody almost missed it. "Some debts, Sheriff," Jedediah said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet resonant with conviction, "ain't paid in coin or land. Some debts are paid in standing up straight when every other soul around you is content to sit down or look away." Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked with measured strides towards his waiting wagon, his broad, powerful back a silent, eloquent testament to burdens carried alone for too long. Later that evening, after ensuring Ilara was safely settled and under Mrs. Gable's capable and compassionate care, Jedediah sat by his solitary campfire, miles deep in the whispering pines, the silent, watchful stars his only companions. The flickering firelight danced on his weathered features, illuminating the haunted, faraway look that rarely, if ever, truly left his eyes. He poked at the crackling logs with a stick, the flames consuming wood much as memory consumed peace. He remembered another pyre, not a platform of shameful auction, but a pyre of furious, ignorant accusation. His own beloved wife, Martha, years ago, in a raw, hard-scrabble mining town further west, a place where fear festered like an untended wound. She'd known the old ways, the herbs of the field, the art of midwifery passed down from her grandmother. When the self-important mayor's sickly child had taken a turn for the worse and died despite Martha's tireless efforts, raw fear and blind ignorance, skillfully fanned into a raging inferno by a man much like Blackwood, a man who coveted their small, prosperous claim, had swiftly, irrevocably labeled her a witch, a consort of devils. He hadn't been strong enough then, too young, too lost in his own shattering grief, too slow to recognize the danger, too paralyzed to act decisively until it was too late. The memory was not just a scar, it was a perpetually open wound, a brand seared onto his very soul. He had bought Ilara today not just for her sake, though her innocent terror had pierced through his carefully constructed defenses, but for Martha's memory, for his own fractured, tormented peace. In the sanctuary of Mrs. Gable's spare but clean room, Ilara, slowly sipping warm broth, confided her story to the older woman. She wasn't a witch, she barely understood what the word truly meant beyond a vessel for inexplicable hatred. She was an orphan, recently arrived in redemption after her parents perished from fever on the trail west, hoping to find honest work. She had briefly cleaned tables and swept floors at Blackwood's Gilded Cage Saloon, where she had quietly but firmly spurned his lewd, unwanted advances. Her polite but unwavering rejection, coupled with her quiet dignity, her noticeable intelligence, and her uncanny knowledge of local plants, knowledge she'd learned from her gentle grandmother, a skill she'd naively used to ease the suffering of a freighter's child down with lung fever when the town's only, often drunk, doctor was away on a spree, became the kindling for Blackwood's hateful, public fire. He wanted to make a terrifying example of her, to assert his absolute dominion over anyone he perceived as weaker, especially a woman who dared to defy him. Mrs. Gable listened, her capable hands clenching in her lap, her heart aching with a fierce, protective anger for the girl. She knew Jedediah was a fundamentally good and honorable man, despite his reclusive nature and profound silence. She also knew, with chilling certainty, that Silas Blackwood was a venomous viper, coiled and ready to strike again. The days that followed were wrapped in a tense, unnatural quiet, the kind of stillness that often precedes a violent storm. Jedediah, true to his word, brought fresh supplies, flour, coffee, dried meat, and once, a small jar of wild honey, to Mrs. Gable's back door for Ilara. His visits were always brief, his words characteristically few, yet his very presence in town, his silent inquiry about Ilara's well-being, was a constant, unspoken promise of steadfast protection. Ilara, tended with gentle hands and kind words by Mrs. Gable, slowly began to shed the haunted, hunted look that had clung to her like a shroud. Color returned to her cheeks, and the perpetual tremor in her hands lessened. She even managed a small, shy smile when Jedediah, looking profoundly awkward, brought her a single, perfectly formed wild columbine, its delicate blue and white petals a stark contrast to the rough bundle of kindling wood he'd also deposited on the porch. He'd simply grunted, nodded, and departed, but the flower remained, a fragile symbol of an unspoken connection, carefully placed in a glass of water on her windowsill. But Silas Blackwood was not a man to be idle when his pride had been so grievously wounded, his authority so publicly flouted. His initial fury had cooled into a simmering, calculated resentment. He couldn't abide the brazen challenge, the loss of face before the entire town. He brooded in his opulent office above the bank, his thoughts as dark and twisted as the ornate ironwork on his windows. He began to gather his hired guns, a motley collection of hard men whose loyalty was easily bought with Blackwood's whiskey and silver, their souls long since pawned or forfeited at the bottom of a bottle or the end of a rope. There was Lefty Gus, whose right hand was a mangled claw from a misjudged knife fight, the Calloway brothers, Ike and Finn, known more for their brute strength than their intellect, and a quiet, snake-eyed man named Reno, who was rumored to have killed men for less than the price of a good horse. Under the heavy cloak of a moonless, starless night, a night designed for treachery and dark deeds, they rode out from Redemption, their horses' hooves muffled on the dusty trail. Their destination was not Mrs. Gable's boarding house, that would be too public, too blatant, even for Blackwood's inflated arrogance, and might finally stir Sheriff Brody from his usual lethargy. No, their target was Jedediah's isolated, vulnerable cabin deep in the Lost Bear Creek Basin. Their plan, whispered by Blackwood with venomous satisfaction, was brutally simple: burn the troublesome lumberjack out like a rat from its nest, perhaps plant some stolen goods to frame him for a new crime, and then, in the ensuing chaos, rescue the unfortunate Ilara from her supposed captor, thereby restoring Blackwood's image as a pillar of the community and a protector of the innocent. They hadn't counted on one crucial thing: Jedediah wasn't in his cabin. He'd sensed the subtle shift in the wind, the too quiet stillness of Blackwood's demeanor during his last supply run into town, the furtive, measuring glances from Blackwood's known associates. Years of solitary living had sharpened his senses to a razor's edge. He was watching, concealed like a patient predator in the dense, familiar tangle of undergrowth and shadow surrounding his small homestead, his old, reliable Spencer repeating rifle resting easily, familiarly, in his capable hands. When the first flickering, resin-soaked torch arced through the inky blackness, thrown by Lefty Gus towards the dry shake roof of his cabin, Jedediah didn't hesitate. A single shot rang out, its crack echoing through the silent forest, not aimed to kill, but to send a clear, unequivocal message. The bullet struck the torch dead center, sending it sputtering and hissing harmlessly into the damp earth, plunging them back into near-total darkness. Blackwood! Jedediah's voice, amplified by the natural acoustics of the silent night, boomed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. This fight is between you and me. Leave the girl out of your cowardly schemes. Blackwood, startled by the sudden shot and the disembodied voice, quickly recovered his bluster, snarling into the darkness, "He's here. The coward's hiding. Spread out, flush him out. $50 to the man who brings me his head." The night, moments before peaceful, erupted into a terrifying symphony of chaos. Muzzle flashes from Blackwood's men erratically lit the darkness like demonic fireflies. Jedediah, moving with the silent, fluid grace of a wraith through the trees and shadows he knew as intimately as the lines on his own hand, became a force of nature, a righteous storm of retribution. He was not a killer by instinct or choice, but he would defend what was right, defend the innocent, with every fiber of his being. He disabled, he disarmed, his shots preternaturally precise in the poor light, aimed at hands gripping pistols, at legs attempting to advance, at rifles being brought to bear. He moved with a grim, focused efficiency, the ghosts of his past, of Martha's unanswered cries, urging him on, fueling his resolve. One by one, Blackwood's men fell, some with cries of pain as bullets shattered bone or tore through muscle, others scrambling away in terrified retreat, their bravado vanishing like morning mist. Blackwood himself, never one for personal courage when the odds weren't overwhelmingly stacked in his favor, saw his plan unraveling with horrifying speed. He turned to flee, to spur his horse back towards the distant, deceptive safety of redemption, but found his horse's rein suddenly, firmly grasped by the steely grip of Sheriff Brody. Behind Brody, illuminated by the flickering lanterns they carried, stood a small, determined posse of townsmen, including a visibly guilt-ridden storekeeper and the blacksmith, men who had stood by silently at Ilara's auction. Brody, following his own gnawing hunch and spurred by Mrs. Gable's earlier quiet but forceful condemnation of Blackwood's character, had gathered them. These townsmen, initially hesitant, ashamed of their earlier cowardice, had been further stirred by the distant sounds of gunfire. The sight that greeted them, Jedediah, one lone man, holding off nearly a dozen armed thugs, fighting not for personal gain or vengeance, but for a deeply held principle, had galvanized them, shaming them into action. Silas Blackwood, Sheriff Brody said, his voice cold and hard as iron, all previous weariness gone. "You're under arrest. For attempted murder, conspiracy to commit arson, and a whole damn list of grievances longer than my arm and twice as ugly." Reno, attempting a last desperate move, found his gun arm suddenly numb from a well-aimed blow from the blacksmith's hammer-like fist. The fight was over. Silas Blackwood, his face a contorted mask of disbelief, sputtering rage, and dawning terror, was roughly disarmed and his hands bound securely behind his back by a grim-faced Sheriff Brody. His expensive coat was torn, his face smudged with dirt, and his reign of petty, cruel tyranny over the town of Redemption was, in that moment, definitively over. As the false dawn, a pale, ethereal wash of grey and nascent rose, began to paint the eastern sky, chasing away the last vestiges of the treacherous night, Jedediah emerged slowly from the deep shadows of the trees. His face was grimy with sweat and powder residue, his simple homespun clothes torn and blood-stained in places from grazes and rough passage through the underbrush, but his eyes, when he finally looked up, were remarkably clear, the haunted shadows within them momentarily banished by the fierce light of action. He walked not towards the subdued, cursing Blackwood, but directly towards Sheriff Brody, his Spencer rifle held loosely, pointing safely towards the ground. "He won't trouble anyone in this valley again, Sheriff," Jedediah said, his voice weary from exertion and the adrenaline crash, but firm with conviction. Brody nodded, a deep respect in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "Thanks to you, Jedediah. You did what we all should have done a long, long time ago. You reminded us what courage looks like." The assembled townsfolk, huddled together, some still clutching makeshift weapons, murmured their solemn agreement, their faces showing a complex mixture of lingering shame for their past inaction and a profound, newfound respect for the silent lumberjack who had spoken so eloquently with his deeds. Ilara, who had been brought to the scene by a deeply worried Mrs. Gable once the shooting had decisively stopped and Brody's posse was seen heading towards the cabin, rushed forward, her earlier fear now completely overshadowed by an overwhelming, luminous gratitude. She didn't speak, couldn't find the words, but her eyes, shining with unshed tears of relief and a dawning hope, said everything that needed to be said as she looked up at her protector. Jedediah looked down at her, at the resilient young woman who had endured so much, and for the first time in more years than he could count, a genuine, if small and fleeting, smile touched his weathered lips, crinkling the corners of his storm-grey eyes. The oppressive shadows that had long resided in their depths seemed to recede, just a little, allowing a sliver of unexpected light to enter. In the weeks and months that followed, the town of Redemption began to undergo a subtle but profound transformation. With Blackwood's malignant influence broken, his assets largely ceased to cover his myriad debts and deceits. A tentative sense of fairness, of communal responsibility, started to bloom in the hard-packed soil. The timber claim deed, legally Jedediah's by right of his courageous purchase, was formally returned to him by a grateful and somewhat abashed town council. But he surprised them all, and Elara most of all, by appearing before the notary the very next day and signing it over, free and clear, into her name. A woman needs her own standing in this world, Elara, he'd said simply, his gaze direct and sincere, when she, bewildered and overwhelmed, had tried to protest. Something that's truly hers. You can hire good men to work the timber, or sell the rights if you choose. It's yours now. A new beginning, earned and deserved. Elara, with the wise counsel and practical help of Mrs. Gable, decided to use a portion of the initial profits from the sustainably managed timber operation to purchase and renovate the dilapidated old mission building at the edge of town. There, she established a small school for the town's children, many of whom had never had formal learning, and a modest infirmary where she could use her inherited knowledge of herbs and healing arts, no longer in the shadows of fear and superstition, but openly, with the growing respect and support of the community. Jedediah remained in his cabin in Lost Bear Creek, still fundamentally a man of few words, a creature of the solitude he had long embraced. Yet, he was no longer entirely solitary. He would often bring a wagonload of perfectly cut firewood to the new schoolhouse, or share a quiet, companionable meal in Mrs. Gable's warm kitchen with the two women who had, in their different ways, helped him find a path back to the world of men. The ghosts of his past, of Martha's tragic end, hadn't vanished entirely. Such deep wounds rarely heal without a trace, but they no longer held sole, tyrannical dominion over his soul. He had faced down injustice, stared into the abyss of his own past failures, and this time, he had not faltered. He had found a measure of profound redemption, not in vengeance, which he had long eschewed, but in selfless protection, in the quiet, resolute affirmation of one vulnerable human being's intrinsic worth against the deafening clamor of greed, ignorance, and fear. The enduring silence of the lumberjack had, in the end, spoken with more power and clarity than 1,000 eloquent speeches, and a town, once cowed and complicit, had finally learned to listen to the whispers of its own conscience. And what about you, who have heard this tale? When you witness an injustice, whether writ large on the world stage or small in the quiet corners of your own life, when you hear the ugly shouts of accusation raised against the vulnerable, the different, the misunderstood, do you lower your eyes and shuffle uncomfortably away, convincing yourself it is not your affair? Or do you find within yourself the often trembling courage to raise your hand, to speak your truth, to offer your strength, even if your voice quakes and your knees feel weak? Think on it. For the true soul of any community, any society, is measured not by its loudest or most powerful voices, but by the quiet, everyday courage of those individuals who choose, often at personal cost, to stand steadfastly for what is fundamentally right and humane. Perhaps you'll find more stories of such unassuming courage if you pause, look, and listen closely. There's always another tale of human spirit waiting to be discovered, another lesson waiting to be learned.